Hello everyone, I'm Rachele. I think this talk actually is a good segue from the one that we just heard. After you manage to let your client know that the biosimilar are actually coming and they go through the panic phase, then after that is, then now what? What do we do? And so today myself and John, I'm going to share the stage with John. We're going to discuss how you can leverage a synergy between competitive intelligence and simulation workshop to optimize your strategy and actually outmaneuver your competition. And we're going to support our claims by discussing a very interesting case study that again is on biosimilar and how we use these two tools in combination to help our client prepare for the entrance of a biosimilar in the market. So quickly going through the agenda for today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what competitive simulation workshops are and how you can use them together with CI. And then my colleague John will walk you through this case study and will tell you how we use CI and CWS together to help our client better define the strategy and the action that they are going to take. And then he will walk you through like what are the key learnings from this experience that we have doing these workshops. But let's start with competitive simulation workshop and talk a little bit about what they are and also, what questions they can help us answer. So, as you may know, you can do competitive simulation workshop throughout the development of a product and during the life cycle management of the product. It really depends on what question you have. And in the graph here, you see on the horizontal axis, you see your planning horizon or your time. And on the vertical axis, you see all the uncertainty and complexity that you might face. And for the purpose of explaining it, we kind of divided the simulation workshop in 3 groups. So in the bottom corner, you have your competitive simulation. And this is typically what you do when you know who the other players are in the market and you also know your environment. In case you have maybe a range of players or some unknown players, but you still know your environment, you might want to run strategic workshops. And in the case that you're really on the unknown about your competitors and your environment, you are going to do some scenario plannings. Of course, in reality, there is not a clear cut. These components kind of blend together. And you could easily, for example, run a workshop where you do some strategic work and you try to understand where you should play. And then you can also ask some question around how you should do it. But ultimately, the workshop should help you understand which direction you should take and also how do you get there. So competitive simulation workshop have some core design principle, if you want, and also some typical exercises that you run. But the most important thing to remember is that these exercises and the structure of the workshop, they need to be heavily tailored for your unique client situation and the questions that you have. So typically you have 2 sessions, and John will give you an example of what it means in real life to have these 2 sessions. And in the first session, you divide your participants usually in group. Often a group plays the home team and the others role play the competitors. And then you regroup as the home team, either in cross-functional team or our functional team, again, depending on the question. And you can run different type of exercise. You might want to see which unique selling point you need to prioritize or refine the messages that you're giving to your payers or even pressure test your position. So there are a range of things that you do, but ultimately the most important thing is that you need to really tailor them and make something bespoke for your client. If you do it well, you should be able to achieve the following 4 things from the workshop. First of all, you should be able to socialize and share the research and the knowledge that you have gathered. And this is where CI comes into play, and I'll get to it in the next slide. You should be able to assess the risk and pressure test your potential positioning with a number of stakeholders. And you should be able also to have some internal discussion, on, the implication on the findings that you have, not just in light of the actual brand that you are doing the workshop for, that you are supporting, but looking, at the broad perspective on your environment and your portfolio, etc. And then ultimately, you should come up with options, like what are your options and what is the best positioning that you can take in the market. I'm not going to try to tell this audience what CI is, but let's say that CI will help you, improve your market intelligence and, make better decisions. That's what you want to do. And CI can be very different depending on the company that runs it, depending on the product that you are supporting, where the product is in development. And you can do CI, for example, a marketing conference. You can go and understand, data from competitors and what are the messagings, etc. But ultimately, CI is a great tool that you can use to really tailor your workshops. For example, if you are in the unknown about your environment, you can do some therapeutic landscape overview. And that's really powerful because then you understand who your competitors are, and you might be able to identify who are the biggest threat. And maybe 2 of them are a bigger threat than others, and you choose that you will simulate those 2 in your workshop. Or again, you might have some assumption that you want to validate ahead of time so you can be even more focused when you go and design your exercises. So this is just an example to show that it's very important to incorporate CI when you think about running a competitive simulation workshop. So for example, through CI, you can do things like understanding the launch timelines of your competitors. And that can become one topic of your workshop. So you could, for example, ask, how do I change? How do I prepare ahead of those timelines? Does anything have to change for us? Or you might be able through CI to understand the messaging that the competitor are going to put out, and also how your KOLs and even your patients, understand it and receive it. And then through the workshop, you can pressure test your own messaging and see if anything needs to change, if you need to do some tweaks. And then another important thing, you want to have the right audience at your workshop. So it's not about inviting everyone, but it's about inviting the relevant people. So here in the blue box, you have some typical potential workshop participants, but ultimately who you want there are your 3 M's. You want your marketing team, your medical team, and your market access team. And then finally, before giving the mic to John, to really have optimum preparedness, what you want to do your competitive intelligence that will bring in all the fresh insights just, before the workshop, so you are ready and you can socialize it in the right environment with the right stakeholders. And then that way you can prepare, with the freshest insight in mind. And now I give it to John, that hopefully will bring this to life with our case study. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Raquel. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Acoustics are good. So what you had there from Raquel was a nice primer on competitive simulation workshops. I'm actually going to go on this side. So, and what I'd like to do is walk you through a real case study. And this is very recent. We just got done with this project in the last couple months. And it took us about 6 months or so, or maybe even longer. I've lost track of time. By the way, there's some of my colleagues from Life Science Dynamics in the room, and they really were instrumental in kind of crafting this presentation and giving feedback. I'd also like to acknowledge the organizers for allowing us this opportunity to give this presentation. But I really want to build on Andrew's question. So Andrew, at the end of Baljit's talk on biosimilars and really using CI, it's, well, what actions does the client take? Or how do you overcome those barriers to your actions, Andrew, if I got your question correctly? And this is where kind of CI stops, and through these workshops, we believe you can take it to the next step. And that's what I'm going to walk you through. So this is the primer on the actual project. It was a large, in this case, a European branch of a large US company, pharma company, which was facing biosimilar competition worldwide, Europe and the States. But they were particularly vulnerable in Europe because of the IP situation. And essentially, they wanted to look at their main European markets, the top markets in Europe, and look at drilling down and looking at company-specific strategies and actions that they could take. Look at quick wins that they could do against the biosimilar entrant. look at how they could align their teams and really work as teams as opposed to silos. And then look at kind of putting together an action plan and a timeline. So that's the gist of it, okay? Everyone with me? What we decided to do is run a two-part workshop. So first part of the workshop was focused on role-playing. And everyone kind of likes to role-play because you want to play the competition, you want to look at those dirty tricks that you'd love to do to your home company, but now you can actually do it in a role-play scenario. And essentially we prepared for that role-play by preparing briefing books. As you know, briefing books seldomly are read, but we had a briefing telecon and briefing meetings to get everyone up to the same page. And then we did something smart, because sometimes people don't listen, or they're distracted, or using their laptop, or trying to do other things and multitask. And we had a one-slide overview of the key assumptions. So this way, we weren't debating the timelines, what kind of different assumptions in terms of their label. All this was clarified in one slide. And that's a nice takeaway if you ever run one of these workshops. Make sure everyone's on the same page and do it smartly. One pager, which we went over at the start of every workshop, really lined up everyone. Everyone's on the bus, as my old professor used to say. From there, we broke out into breakout teams. And we were really looking heavily as biosimilar, especially in Europe, as you all know. It's all about price, tendering, contracting, right? So that was a big emphasis of this particular workshop. But it was also about strategy and tactics. How do you segment the market? This was kind of a niche area, so it's not a broad biosimilar. And then finally, what are some quick wins that as the competitor you could do against the home team? And again, here we didn't use a home team. We saved that for the second part. We just worked as competitors. And then we played that back in terms of presentations, okay? What kind of things did we look at? And I'm going to go a little bit quickly just in the interest of time here. But we looked at essentially what were the decision criteria when you bring a biosimilar. And as you know, in Europe, it can kind of be all over the map. But this was kind of the biosimilar rule set, if you will, in terms of who makes the decision. Is it physician-led? Is it hybrid? Or is it payer-driven? And we kind of group this, this is classic archetype grouping as it's known. This is specific, by the way, for this particular biosimilar, and there was some surveys done to do this by the client and that we were involved with to shape this and look at the results and kind of synthesize it. But this is very important to really understand what kind of environment is the biosimilar launching into. And equally important, excuse me, went too fast, is the tendering environment. So tenders are basically, for those that know in market access, are requests for proposals to offer essentially a product with terms and conditions. And they're a bit different in contracting. I'll show you that in a second. But again, we got that information working with the client and working with their affiliates to really look at the specifics of how it works in individual European markets. The other thing we realized is, especially some of the market access folks and the commercial folks know this term tendering and contracting like the back of their hand, but the medical folks in this kind of 3M team, marketing, medical, and market access, as Raquel mentioned, medical folks were not really up on that. They heard it, but they didn't quite understand the difference. What does that mean in some markets? So here, another key learning is make sure everyone's educated on these terms, is on the same page. What's the difference between the two? I think most of you understand that. If not, we've got it in the presentation to reflect on. So you say, well, John, where are you going with all this? Well, that built into our second day or the second part of the workshop, I should say. Here we call it day 2, where we looked at the threats of these role-play biosimilar teams, and we put together a matrix, very simple matrix, where we looked at those threats by time and impact, right? You'll see an example of some of this a little later. And then we came back as home teams, split out into different teams. We decided originally that we wanted to do functional teams, but then we realized there was actually some synergies and benefits of doing cross-functional teams. So if you have the chance, if you have enough critical mass, functional teams could be very interesting to look at medical silo, market access silo, commercial marketing silo. But if you don't, cross-functional teams can make up for, there was an issue with the lack of medical representatives available for these workshops, for instance. Then another thing we did is we used a surprise scenario. So we gave the worst case scenario to the home team, to the client team, to really pressure test their thinking. I'll show you what that looks like here. We didn't do all three, but we picked one of these three that you see on the slide. The first panel on the left shows a second entrant comes at about the same time or right after. Middle panel is, in Europe, there's something called automatic substitution or fully interchangeable. That's a regulatory term. If Belgique was here, he could tell you a lot more about it, but it's something in terms of how biosimilars are allowed to be utilized. And the third scenario is we had the biosimilar player actually have a more attractive dosage form, administrative form, than the innovator. So we really kind of stacked the deck just to pressure test what would you do as the client team, kind of in a worst case scenario, not using all three because then you overload people and they say, okay, I give up. But if you use this smartly in the different markets, you can really try to get, okay, what are your contingency scenarios? So what happened and what did we do with all this? I'm actually going to move back over here because I want to show you a little more detail. What you see on the left panel is your typical kind of positioning ladder. And this, we're going to use the magnifier, is kind of, your features, your benefits, your values, your positioning statement, and then it's essentially being customized as you go up. What we decided to do is get much more granular. And this is kind of one of the learnings that we would like to share with you is really go across the stakeholders, from the healthcare professionals on top to the payers and access, to patients, caregivers, and patient association groups, to existing competitors and future competitors. So here, and you see the call-out boxes of things to look at, but this is really important because essentially a good strategy and plans and tactics, as you'll see, will be getting into the details and getting specific and granular. Go to the next one. You saw those two panels on the left. Actually, the lower panel you didn't see. Let me just show you. And again, this was something put together. Some of you were interested in the slides with the maps of the biosimilar market and the tendering. But these were some of the detail that we were able to work with the client to get in terms of what market works and all the specifics. Belgique touched on this in his last presentation. But again, getting into the specifics of how this will work in a particular market is really the key. And then, okay, what do you do with this? What do you do with this information that you get from the role playing? So an example of the role playing was to really look at two scenarios. One was, as you see on the top, a conservative pricing. One was a more aggressive pricing. One was to look at different rebates. One was to look at other incentives involved. And here another tip that I'd like to share with you is pre-populate some of these exercises. So the numbers you see in red, the ranges there, were something where we didn't want to have teams debating what's a conservative versus an aggressive price. So it was really looking at, let's agree on this, and then what are you going to do about it? Same thing on the bottom of the slide. What are you going to do in terms of the first tender and then subsequent tenders? And then the timing comes into this. So there's a lot of complexity that can come in very quickly. And the idea is just kind of breaking this apart into steps and looking at what are, in this case, the action items, and then what are the caveats, the limitations, the conditions that you need to consider when you look at these action points. And those are some of the key outputs that we got working through these scenarios. We also kind of forced the teams to look at what are the typical, if you will, attributes on the right, and how could those be deployed over time? So what you see is now to launch, first year of launch, subsequent years of launch, and then the impact on a kind of qualitative scale of low to high, and plotting those using the conjoint analogy. This afternoon there will be a presentation on conjoint analysis if you're interested, but essentially force fitting, taking one box on the right and putting it into a quadrant and debating as a team, okay, what do we deploy first, which is more priority, why is that, Are there things that can group together? We had some grouping examples where we allowed people to kind of take themes and group it. So you need to be a bit dynamic, but the idea is you're essentially prioritizing, right? You're trying to, it's spring here in Italy, a large bee just flew by me. But you're really trying to get the group to prioritize and build, to Andrew's point earlier, is how do you get stakeholders to form some consensus of, there's action you can take. These are some of the key outputs from the workshop. One was, on the left, was key actions that you can do and to really understand what are the options, so the strategies and tactics to summarize. The middle was really prioritization and scaling it, and we worked with the client to look at different timelines and ways to prioritize. And the third was to really put an action plan with some timelines behind it, so kind of linking those three pieces together. So what are some of the key learnings? I've mentioned a couple as we've gone along, but I'd like to just summarize before we open it up to questions. One is what I call the elephant in the room, and my colleagues and I were kind of joking with this analogy, but more and more, as you know, companies, other than Novartis, has decided to spin out their biosimilar division of Sandoz, not to pick on Andrew, but many companies have some sort of an affiliation or even an in-house biosimilar unit, right? So in one way, they're kind of fighting on, biosimilar entrants, but on the other side, they're also engaging in the biosimilar marketplace, right? So it's, okay, the elephant in his room is we can't really bash biosimilars, right? Biosimilars are proven, there's regulatory pathways, as we've heard. So how do we differentiate a biosimilar, or our brand versus biosimilar? Any ideas? Andrew, put you on the spot.
Not my area.
Oh. Yeah.
Novel device.
Exactly. So thank you very much. Novel device or administration format, looking at services, of course, education, programs. As a branded company, you have years of data, outcome data, registries. So it's basically all the things around the product, because the product itself, you're going to have to basically, it's not like the old days where biosimilars first came to the market. They are equivalent. Europe, FDA, most regulatory authorities, it's basically an interchangeable drug in most cases. There are caveats to it, and we can talk offline about that. But essentially, you've got to differentiate somehow, other than, the brand playing the pricing spiral game, right? 1 second, I'm going to take your, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but what are you doing with biobetters like surgery and developing?
Very good question. So that is, to me, a great way to use these types of workshops to really look at a biobetter. So to the point earlier, is the biobetter a more convenient dosage form? Is it a more potent, as we've seen with some of the new biosimilars that are currently in the press? That's a great question. And I think this methodology that Raquel and I talked about of using a competitive simulation workshop really can get you to get to a better action plan on a biobetter as well. The other thing I'd like to mention is ideally, you'd like to have this an iterative process, that you come back to this, look at things, changes in the market. Is the biobetter, for instance, got data that supports some of their claims, those types of things. So as we get towards the end here, basically we're taking the primary CI that Raquel mentioned, we're taking the idea of the workshop and the example I showed you, and we're superimposing it into the biologics and biosimilar marketplace to really get to kind of the best, if you will, of these, combining this, being prepared with deep insights. A couple tips for preparing a workshop like this. It's all in the prep. Okay, so starting with the objectives in the lower left, syncing that right away with what are the outputs, and then designing. My key role within Life Science Dynamics is to really help design workshops and look at options. I also, many times, am facilitating workshops with some colleagues, but getting this kind of triad done correctly, and getting the prep done, and getting alignment in the organization and stakeholder input that this is what we want to get out of it. So here's the last slide before I'm going to ask one more other question. I won't put Andrew on the spot again because he's already, yeah. What are the learnings here? One is to incorporate CI, obviously, and we're here at a CI conference, market research conference. Use this integrated approach of the 3M, the marketing, commercial, the medical, and the market access. Get granular with the exercises. Don't use generic positioning or generic exercise. Really get into the detail, because the more detail you get, especially role-playing the competitor, the better you can build plans to essentially address in mitigation steps. Gain new insights. A lot of times we got new ideas into different markets. No one, brainstorming. And again, where possible, we did these actually physically, right? So we went to these countries. We're like on a European tour for a couple months with colleagues. And it was great because you got not only to get the insights, but in small chat, like we're going to have lunch next, you got to understand in much more detail things. Drive action, so I've made the point. And address that elephant in the room, okay? Biosimilars are here, and companies have either partnerships or maybe even an in-house biosimilar unit, or alliances with biosimilar companies. So bashing biosimilars is kind of not where you want to go. So with that, I leave one last question, and if I could show a kind of a raise of hands, how many of you would consider running a CSW, a competitive simulation workshop, if you've got facing a biosimilar threat? Did I convince anyone? Few people. Yes. Thank you very much. Raquel and I will come up. Raquel will come up, and we'll take any questions or comments you have. And then I know we are between you and lunch, but we appreciate your kind attention. So thank you. You guys are hungry. Hungry on. Oh, Andrew, thank you.
Yeah, I'm hungry, but we've got 7 minutes, so we're good. We're ahead of schedule. Great job. So your elephant in the room.
Yeah.
You've got your.
You like my elephant?
I like it a lot. So we're bashing the biosimilar competitor. Yet we have our own biosimilars, except we know Novartis won't before too long. Have you ever considered bringing in someone from your client from the biosimilar sort of a different project to really shake things up? And how did it go?
That's what was one of the key things, and that was the point about choosing your participants, right? Because they can give you quite a bit of insights also on how things works, and what you are allowed to say, what you cannot say. And then I think another point is that we gave the example of the biosimilar, and this is the elephant for the biosimilar, but when you are in different therapy areas, you might have other elephants to consider. So it's very important to choose not only your exercises, but also who should be in the room.
That's great. Thanks.
And just adding to that, Andrew, we had one region where they're very kind of in your face looking at it. We had one of their commercial leads for the biosimilar division come, and we had to kind of, the mindset of biosimilar company is very different than a branded pharma company. So it's like tuck, tuck, tuck. There's kind of a playbook of things, and they're very much down their, if you will, way of thinking, where they exclude everything else. And we had to say, no, from the branded side, we're trying to look at opportunities. So some of that is just managing, if you will, functions and sometimes personality. So it can be tricky.
Another elephant in the room, so the elusive COGS. So price estimation, especially in tendering countries, is crucial. So did you include your price based on estimations, or did you also include, say, insights from the manufacturing side?
So for this specific example, we did quite a bit of work also before the workshop with the client, where they thought about, their estimation and what they were expecting in terms of price, and they spoke with each affiliates, and, they gave the information to us. So we did a lot of that. But I would say like a lot of change during the workshop then when in the countries for which we run them. So, but yeah, there was, you know, it's up to the client really, but at that point, the more we can get from the countries, the easier it is to, you know, get closer to reality. But then, you know, after a workshop like this, you can also do like proper pricing exercise, which was not included in this. It was like only initial snippet, I would say.
So, everyone's hungry. Thank you again for your kind attention and this opportunity. Have a nice lunch.